it is a uniquely terrifying feeling when a massive quarter-making deal is just sitting right there on the 1-yard line.
Oh, yeah, the absolute worst.
Right. Like the client is ready to sign, and your entire team just completely stalls. And why? Because the only person who actually knows how to price this specific, highly complex order is, on a beach in Florida for the next 2 weeks.
It is the classic single point of failure. I mean, you see it in surprisingly large, highly sophisticated companies every single day.
Yeah.
The whole business literally just holds its breath waiting for one person to get back to their laptop.
Exactly. Well, welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are looking directly at you and your team's tech stack. Our mission for this deep dive is to help you figure out if your team actually needs AI-native software tools, or if you're just, getting caught up in the current hype cycle.
Because there is a lot of hype out there right now.
Tons of it.
Yeah.
So we've got a really fascinating stack of architectural breakdowns, industry guides, and some great notes from Customware. And we're focusing on quoting software, AI agentic platforms, and the rapidly shifting economics of building versus buying software in 2026.
Right, because the economics have fundamentally changed over the last couple of years, but the operational nightmares that you just described, those remain exactly the same.
Right.
Companies are basically trying to apply brand new tools to old, deeply ingrained problems.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we even talk about the technology, we really have to look at why business processes are so slow and error-prone to begin with.
Yeah.
Because when a deal stalls out, the root cause usually isn't the software itself, right? It's the human bottleneck.
That's exactly it. And the primary driver behind that human bottleneck is a very specific phenomenon known as tribal knowledge.
Tribal knowledge.
Yeah, it sounds a bit like, I don't know, an anthropology term, but in a business context, it's about that veteran employee. What you call him, Dave?
The classic Ask Dave scenario. I mean, if I'm listening to this right now, I probably have a Dave on my team.
Oh, most companies do. I mean, tribal knowledge is basically the undocumented, highly person-dependent set of rules that lives exclusively in Dave's head.
Just floating around in there.
Right. It is the...
Which leads to a massive structural issue for the company, because Dave is usually, what, a sales engineer or a senior estimator, right?
Yeah, usually your absolute most brilliant and expensive talent.
Right. But because they're the only ones holding this tacit conditional knowledge, they end up functioning as human calculators. They just become a human CPQ, a configure price, quote, system.
It's a huge waste.
It really is. I was looking through the time tracking studies in our notes, and it shows that these highly paid engineers can waste up to 4 hours a day just checking SKU compatibility for junior sales reps.
It is a devastating misallocation of resources. You have top-tier engineering talent doing basic data validation because the standard company software just can't handle the conditional logic.
Yeah.
And the real danger hits when that expert leaves. Whether they, retire to that beach in Florida or take a call from a competitor, that complex web of knowledge vanishes instantly.
Just gone overnight.
Poof. And the immediate result is slower onboarding for new hires, mathematically incorrect quotes reaching the customer, lost margins, and just massive production delays.
Now, I have to push back on this a little bit.
Sure.
If I'm a sales director or a general manager listening to this, I'm thinking, hey, this is an easy fix.
Mm-hmm.
Just sit Dave down on a Friday and make him write it all out, right? Make a standard operating procedure, an SOP, put it in the company wiki, and boom, the tribal knowledge is captured. Why doesn't that work?
Well,
Because to me, it feels a bit like trying to get a family recipe from your grandmother. Like she writes down, add a pinch of salt, but what she actually means is a highly precise calculation based on the humidity in the room, the size of the tomatoes, and, a lifetime of culinary instinct. You can't just write that down in a Word doc.
what's fascinating here is that is a brilliant way to look at it, and it highlights exactly why the just write it down approach completely fails in corporate environments. SOPs, wikis, training manuals, they are what we call broadcast mediums. They simply broadcast a description of the right answer, but they decay rapidly.
Because things change so fast.
Exactly. By the time Dave finishes writing the wiki, the supply chain costs have shifted and the rules are already outdated.
So the grandmother analogy totally holds up.
It does, but let's take it a step further. When a junior sales rep is under intense pressure on the last day of the quarter, trying to close a really complex custom quote, they are not going to dig through a SharePoint folder to find a PDF that might be 6 months out of date.
No way. They're just going to pick up the phone and call Dave.
Exactly. People under pressure route to humans, not documents. For knowledge to actually survive and be useful, it cannot just be documented, it must be encoded into an execution medium.
An execution medium meaning the software itself.
Yes, the software itself has to actively validate, prompt, and enforce those rules in real time as the user is working.
Okay, so human memory is a terrible, fragile container for business rules, and wikis are basically useless under pressure. We clearly need software. Right. And if I'm following the logic, I imagine most leaders hit this exact point, pull out the company credit card, and just go buy a generic off-the-shelf quoting tool, like Salesforce Revenue Cloud, DealHub, something like that.
That is usually the instinct, yeah.
But reading through the industry guides here, they make a very strong point that for certain industries, specifically manufacturing, these generic tools just completely break down.
Oh, they absolutely shatter. And it really comes down to fundamentally different business models.
How so?
Generic CPQ tools were primarily designed by and for SaaS companies, retail, and businesses with standard product catalogs. Their underlying architecture assumes you have a finite set of independent checkboxes and a standard static price list,
But manufacturing is a totally different beast. I mean, you're dealing with physical reality and physics.
which introduces something called configuration constraint logic.
Okay, what is that?
So let's say a customer selects a 14-foot beam span for a custom industrial structure. In a SaaS software tool, selecting 14 feet is just clicking a drop-down menu.
Yeah.
But in manufacturing, selecting that 14-foot span means certain cross-sections suddenly become structurally required, while other materials become physically invalid and actually dangerous to use.
Now, I'm having a hard time picturing why this is such a roadblock.
Yeah.
Like, if I'm a mid-market manufacturer, why can't I just customize Salesforce to handle my geometry? It's a multi-billion-dollar platform. Surely there's a settings tab somewhere for physical constraints, right?
You'd think so, but you can't just flip a switch because the foundational data model of generic software isn't built to understand spatial relationships or cascading physical rules.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so if the software doesn't natively enforce that geometry, the junior sales rep might configure a 14-foot beam with a thin flange that literally cannot support its own weight.
Yikes.
The generic software approves the, quote, the customer signs, it goes to the production floor, and the engineers realize they've just sold a physically impossible object.
That is a nightmare.
It is. Now you either have to go back to the customer and look completely incompetent, or you eat thousands of dollars in custom engineering costs to somehow make it work.
Man. And the pricing isn't just a simple database lookup either, right?
Mm.
The sources talked about variable, BOM-driven pricing. For those outside of manufacturing, BOM stands for Bill of Materials. So how does that actually get calculated if it's not just a static price tag?
The price is a dynamic formula. It is the cost of raw materials on that specific day, plus estimated labor hours, plus overhead, plus your target margin.
Right.
And that entire formula recalculates with every single micro adjustment the customer requests.
That sounds incredibly heavy for a standard CRM to handle.
It is. Furthermore, manufacturing involves engineer-to-order handoffs, or ETO. Standard SaaS quoting tools are built to close a deal instantly. But in manufacturing, you can't always spit out a final price on the spot.
Because the engineers have to check it first.
Exactly. The quote has to capture the sales rep's preliminary configuration, hold that data, and route it to an engineer to review the specs, all without blocking or crashing the broader sales pipeline.
So what actually happens when a manufacturer forces this generic tool on their team anyway? Because a lot of companies do, right?
Yeah.
The board says, everyone uses this big enterprise brand. We should too.
Oh, they do it all the time. They try to jam their beautiful, complex geometric rules into a basic sauce box. And it results in what the industry calls shadow systems.
Shadow systems. I love that term.
It sounds cool, but it's terrible for business. The generic software simply cannot handle the edge cases, the dynamic formulas, or the tribal logic. So to keep the business running, the sales ops team starts keeping a parallel Excel spreadsheet to track everything the official, very expensive software gets wrong.
Oh, that sounds like an absolute nightmare. You're paying, what, 6 figures for an enterprise software license? And your team is still doing the actual math manually in a hidden spreadsheet.
Exactly. That shadow spreadsheet is a massive hidden tax on the company. The generic software has become a constraint.
Right.
Instead of the software serving the business, you end up forcing your business to bend its processes to fit the limitations of the software vendor's screen.
Wow.
Over time, you just lose the competitive edge that your complex pricing model was supposed to give you in the first place.
Okay, so generic software basically forces you to dumb down your business. I imagine a lot of founders hit that wall, get super frustrated, see an ad for ChatGPT on Twitter, and think, I'll just have AI code my own custom software.
Yep, that's the next logical jump for a lot of people.
Does that actually work?
Okay.
Because the sources dive pretty heavily into this new trend called vibe coding.
Vibe coding is such a fascinating term. It refers to using consumer AI builders tools like Cursor, Bolt, or Lovable.
Right.
A completely non-technical person just types a plain language prompt like, build me a quoting dashboard for steel beams, and the AI spits out a beautiful, functioning user interface in like 20 minutes.
It feels like magic. You just describe it and it appears on your screen.
For rapid prototyping, idea validation, or putting together a quick demo for investors, these tools are genuinely incredible. But when it comes to actual business operations, vibe coding is a dangerous mirage.
The new barrage.
Yeah, it hits what architects call the production gap.
Okay, where does it fall apart?
These consumer tools generate code at incredible speed, but they do not generate production-grade architecture. For instance, they lack persistent, schema-stable databases. So if you build a quick quoting app in one of these tools, your data might just be sitting in a local JSON file or a really lightweight SQLite setup.
Okay, pause right there. You're losing me a bit with schema-stable and JSON files. Like, as a sales VP listening to this, what I care about is, will this crash on the last day of the quarter?
Fair enough.
Tell me what data sitting in a JSON file actually means for my daily operations. Like, why is that physically dangerous for my team?
Okay, great point. Think of a JSON file like keeping all of your company's critical customer records on a single massive digital sticky note.
Okay.
It's really fast to write on, but there are absolutely no rules. The second two different sales reps try to update a quote at the exact same time, or the moment you decide to change how a specific discount is calculated, that sticky note corrupts and all your data is scrambled.
Oh man, that is terrifying.
Right. Consumer AI tools generate code linearly, line by line, based on statistical probability. They are literally just guessing the next most logical word. They completely lack the architectural foresight required to step back and design a secure, interconnected database from scratch.
And what about security? If the AI is just guessing the next line of code based on vibes, how does it handle access control?
It usually just doesn't. Authentication in vibe-coded apps is often hard-coded or entirely absent. Oh, wow. So if you're listening to this and you've ever had, say, a third-party contractor accidentally see your executive-level pricing tiers because an intern built a quick internal app without proper access control, you know exactly how painful this production gap actually is.
That happens way more often than you'd think. And furthermore, vibe-coded apps have no automated test coverage and no real deployment pipeline.
Right.
If the app breaks on a Friday afternoon, it throws a complex error report, a stack trace. The person who prompted the AI to build the app doesn't know how to read a stack trace, so they literally can't fix it.
So to go back to the grandmother's recipe analogy from earlier, if I want to build a house, vibe coding is like using AI to draw a beautiful, photorealistic sketch of a house and expecting to move your family in.
Yes.
But the walls are made of paper, there's no plumbing whatsoever, and the doors don't have locks.
It's a sketch, not a blueprint. And you definitely shouldn't run a business out of a paper house. But the sources do highlight an alternative, right? A way to actually build custom software with AI that doesn't just collapse under the weight of the business. They call it governed agentic build platforms. Ransomware is heavily cited here.
Yes, exactly.
So if vibe coding is the paper house, how is a governed platform acting differently?
To stick with your analogy, a governed agentic platform acts as a highly disciplined general contractor.
Okay.
You still hand them the beautiful sketch, and you still use plain language to describe what you want. But instead of one single AI just guessing line by line, you are directing a structured, coordinated team of AI agents acting in distinct roles.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, one AI acts as the plumber, laying out the data pipes, another acts as the systems architect, building the foundation, and another acts as the city inspector, running automated tests to ensure everything is up to code before you launch.
So it's applying actual software engineering discipline to your specific domain knowledge.
Yes. The output isn't a fragile prototype. It is governed, production-grade software. You get a real relational database designed for complex changes, server-side logic that securely hides and executes your proprietary pricing formulas.
Which solves the access control problem.
Exactly. Plus, you get end-to-end automated testing so you don't crash on the last day of the quarter, and a real publishing pipeline. And crucially, you own the code and the data outright. You aren't just renting a vendor's platform.
So the technology absolutely exists today to build production-grade custom AI tools without needing to hire a massive, $2 million development team.
It does.
But this brings us to the ultimate, really practical question for you, the listener. How do you know if your team actually needs to build a custom AI native tool, or if you should just, buy an off-the-shelf product and accept the limitations?
It's the classic build versus buy decision, but the math has completely shifted in 2026 because building is no longer an 18-month high.
And looking at the ROI of getting this right, the numbers are just staggering. Let's break down the math from the sources really quickly.
Sure.
If a sales rep is using a manual shadow spreadsheet to calculate a quote, and they make a tiny 2% manual error on a $100,000 deal, that is $2,000 instantly wiped from your net profit, just gone.
Yeah.
Do that 10 times a year, and that's $20,000 lost per rep, purely on typos. Not to mention the opportunity cost. The research shows that without custom quoting tools, top-tier reps spend up to 12.5% of their entire year acting as data entry clerks.
That is insane.
That is 6 weeks a year where your best closers just aren't selling.
Exactly. So let's look at when you should buy off-the-shelf software. You buy when your pricing consists of standard catalog SKUs. You have stable, predictable discount tiers.
Right.
Your workflow naturally fits into a vendor's default configuration without anyone on your team needing to invent a manual workaround. If that perfectly describes your business, generic SaaS is fast, relatively cheap, and perfectly adequate.
But when do you build?
You build when your business logic is tribal. If your quoting rules live in two veterans' heads and a highly complex Excel file, off-the-shelf software will fail you.
Every time.
You build when pricing depends on compound conditions like calculating raw materials plus regional shipping factors multiplied by specific channel margins.
Or, when you are just suffering from massive sauce sprawl, like when you're paying exorbitant per seat licensing fees that are compounding and scaling aggressively just because you hired a few more sales reps.
That is a huge factor. And this is perhaps the biggest red flag you build if you had a previous CPQ implementation that completely stalled or failed.
Oh, yeah.
That failure usually doesn't mean the vendor's software was intrinsically bad. It means the vendor's underlying data model simply could not stretch to handle your operational edge cases.
So what does this all mean for you? Take a hard look at your own team's tech stack this week. Are your employees currently creating manual workarounds? Are they logging into a shadow system just to avoid triggering a higher SaaS tier?
Right.
Are they ignoring the official expensive enterprise tool because it doesn't actually understand how your business makes money?
Because if your quoting rules, your specific material calculations, or your unique operational logic are the actual reasons customers choose you over a competitor, you cannot put that into a generic tool.
No.
Putting your unique logic into generic software flattens your competitive advantage into a commodity process.
That is such a powerful way to frame it. Software should encode your edge, not erase it.
Exactly.
So to quickly recap our journey today, we started by looking at tribal knowledge, that hidden human bottleneck where all your most valuable business rules are trapped in the heads of a few key experts.
Right.
We saw how generic software, especially in physically complex spaces like manufacturing, forces you to create fragile shadow spreadsheets because the tool's data model just can't handle the reality of your pricing.
And we also unpacked why you can't just vibe code your way out of the problem. Those fast AI consumer tools give you a really pretty interface, but they completely lack the architectural foresight, the databases, and the security to actually run a business.
But we found the solution in governed AI native tools, platforms that act as a disciplined construction crew, allowing you to finally encode your unique tribal business rules into secure production-ready software that you actually own.
Couldn't have said it better.
Well, before we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final kind of provocative thought to mull over.
Okay, let's hear it.
We've spent this entire time talking about encoding human expertise into software. But if governed AI platforms can eventually flawlessly encode and execute all of our current tribal knowledge, if the software can perfectly run the most complex conditional rules your veterans have spent decades learning, does the definition of a human expert fundamentally change?
Wow. That is a fascinating question, because if the machine holds all the current rules, what does the human actually do?
Right. Because once the AI is executing the established rules perfectly, perhaps human expertise will no longer be about knowing the current parameters. Maybe the expert of the future is simply the person who has the creative freedom to invent entirely new ways to compete.
I love that.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Take a look at your own shadow systems this week. See what tribal knowledge is hiding in plain sight before your own expert decides it's time to retire to that beach in Florida. We'll catch you next time.